Following the 2004 presidential election, one of the big news stories was the moral values vote. According to exit polls at the time, 22% of voters chose moral values as the issue that most influenced their vote, and 80% of these folks voted for George Bush. Now, based on media coverage at the time, one might have thought that conservatives thought moral values were very important and liberals did not, and needless to say, liberals rejected this interpretation and in fact had difficulty seeing what was moral about voting to prohibit same-sex marriage, stem cell research, legal abortion. Now clearly, the left and the right both hold strong moral values, though different ones. And psychologists have studied moral reasoning for decades. However, they've rarely looked at these differences in the conceptions of morality on the left and the right, and this is what piqued my interest. So we began by turning to the most fundamental distinction in motivation within psychology, and that is the distinction between approach and avoidance. Years of psychological research have supported the existence of these two systems, an approach and avoidance system. The approach system is based on focusing, actually, on positive outcomes, on activating behaviors so that one can approach these desirable ends. The avoidance system, on the other hand, is focused on negative outcomes. It involves prohibiting, inhibiting, withdrawing behaviors to avoid negative outcomes. So imagine or consider the following examples. The 2004 moral value voter might see morality as a matter of prohibiting same-sex marriage or stem cell research, but for another person, morality is really about helping others. Charity, helping those less fortunate in society. For a third person, morality might be about working very hard, pulling one's own weight. And a fourth might see morality as saying no to drugs or alcohol, for example. Now, in some of these cases, working hard, helping others, the motivation is to approach positive outcomes. That is to provide for the well-being or advancement of the self or others. In other cases, prohibiting stem cell research, for example, or saying no to drugs, the motivation is about avoiding negative outcomes. That is, protecting the self and others from what are perceived as threats or harms. So we use this approach avoidance motivation as the first dimension to categorize morality, and to this we added a second, which is whether the moral judgment is focused on one's own behavior, that would be a self-focus, or focused really more on the social group involving broader social regulation. When you cross these two dimensions, that is approach avoidance and self-social or self-other focus, you come up with 4 cells to the model. We developed scales to measure each of these. Let me just very briefly say something about each of them. Self-restraint is an avoidance motivation focused on protecting the self. It involves exercising self-control, self-discipline, and resisting temptation. Social order is another avoidance motivation, but in this case, avoidance motive, in this case, it involves focusing on the group and protecting the group from threats. Now, these could be threats to the physical well-being of the group or psychological threats to the common identity of the group. The two approach motives are self-reliance, which involves providing for the self and involves working hard, industriousness, what we often think of in terms of the Protestant ethic in this society. And the group-based or the social-based approach motive would be social justice. That is, protecting the well-being or the group's welfare, providing for the group's welfare. This would involve altruism, egalitarianism, benevolence, for example. Okay, so the question is, in terms of this model, what do liberals and conservatives look like? And what can we learn about their basic motivations based on differences we might find? Well, in our research we have found that political conservatism is positively associated with avoidance motives, and liberalism with approach motives. More specifically, conservatives are high, relative to liberals, on self-restraint and social order. Liberals are particularly high on social justice, which is an approach motive. But what's particularly interesting is that Self-reliance and social justice for liberals. Now, recall, these are the two approach motives. For social liberals, these are in a positive relationship. That is, the more they believe in providing for the self, the more they believe in providing for others, suggesting a general approach orientation. This relationship is actually a negative one in the case of conservatives. That is, the more they believe in providing for themselves, the less they believe in providing for others, suggesting the lack of any kind of approach, general approach orientation. So when you think about political campaigns, it's not surprising then that fear sells better among conservatives and hope sells better among liberals. Alternatively, foreign policy or national security concerns, I should say, sell better among conservatives, and bread and butter issues among liberals. So back to the 2004 moral values vote, what this is really about is an avoidance-based morality. Clearly, moral values are not the exclusive province of one group or another. Both liberals and conservatives hold strong but different moral values, which differ based on their fundamental motivation, or the motivation underlying them. In trying to better understand these motivations, and in particular, in recognizing that both groups, liberals and conservatives, are morally motivated, we may not reach greater agreement, but we may approach the makings of a more civil society.